Read it again. Read it one more time.
I have read it 3 times. The words do not change.
Are you telling this court that King Obiora, our king, the man who sat on that throne for 40 years, was never a man? King Obiora was a woman, from the first day to the last. No, no, no! This cannot be true! How could this happen? This is a tragedy! The oracle has spoken. This is a lie. This is an abomination. This cannot be.
It is not a lie. I was there the night she was born. I was there the night she died. And I made a promise to keep her secret until her last breath left this earth. That breath left last night. And now, the truth belongs to all of you.
The day King Obiora died, the entire kingdom of Edo wept. Warriors who had never cried in battle pressed their faces into their palms. Market women abandoned their stalls and sat in the dust. Children who had only ever known one king stared at the palace gates in silence, not fully understanding what had been lost, only feeling that something enormous had left the earth. For 40 years, King Obiora had ruled Edo with a hand that was firm but never cruel. Wars had been won, harvest had been blessed, disputes between villages that had boiled for generations had been settled under that one voice, that one presence, that one undeniable authority. Edo had not merely survived under King Obiora. Edo had become something greater, an empire, a name that other kingdoms whispered with both fear and respect. And for 40 years, not one person had known the truth. Not one. Her name, the name her mother gave her before the world took everything else, was Adaize. She was born the only child of King Emenike, ruler of Edo, in a time when the kingdom was strong but fragile in the way all powerful things are fragile. Strong on the outside, hollow at the center. Because King Emenike had no son, and in Edo, a kingdom without a male heir was a kingdom already dying. The elders had made that clear from the moment Adaize took her first breath. They had stood outside the birthing hut, listened for the cry, and when the midwife emerged with her face carrying news instead of celebration, the senior chief had said only 4 words. Then the king ends. King Emenike had not slept that night. He had sat outside under the sky and spoken to his ancestors in a voice too quiet for anyone to hear. He had asked them why. He had asked them what he was supposed to do. He had asked them if a daughter could carry what his son was supposed to carry. The ancestors did not answer him that night, but Adaize did. She answered him every single day of her childhood. She was not the kind of child that sat still. From the time she could walk, she followed her father everywhere. Into the court, into the war council, into the fields where disputes were settled. She sat at his feet and listened to things that no child her age was supposed to understand. And she understood all of it. Every argument, every strategy, every silence that carried more meaning than words. By the time she was 7, she could recite the land boundaries of every village under Edo's authority. By 10, she had memorized the terms of every peace agreement her father had ever signed. By 13, she was correcting the council advisors in private, pointing out errors in their calculations, flaws in their reasoning, inconsistencies in their records. She did it quietly, the way her father had taught her, never loudly. Power announced itself through results, not noise. her father watched all of this and felt two things at the same time. Pride so deep it almost hurt, and a grief he could not name.
Because none of it would matter. That was the law. That was the world she had been born into. It did not matter how sharp her mind was, or how steady her hands were, or how clearly she could see what others could not. She was a woman, and the throne of Idu could not pass to a woman. The elders had already begun making arrangements. There were 3 nephews from the king's brothers' line, distant blood, men who had never set foot in the palace court for more than a feast, men who knew nothing about Idu except that it was theirs to inherit. The senior chief had already begun quiet conversations. The council was already beginning to lean. King Emenike watched his kingdom slipping toward a future he could not trust. And one night, when Adaize was 15 and the stars were out and the compound was empty, he called her to him. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "If you were a man, there would be nothing to decide." Adaize looked back at her father and said, "Then make me one." He had not expected that. He had expected tears or argument or the kind of quiet resignation he had seen in her mother. He had not expected those 5 words, delivered without hesitation, without fear, with the same calm certainty that he himself had used in war councils for 30 years. He stared at her. She did not look away. That night changed everything. It took 2 years of careful preparation. 2 years of silence, secrecy, and the kind of planning that could not afford a single mistake. King Emenike had only 2 people he trusted completely. His personal physician, a man named Umosu, who had served the royal family for 30 years and kept secrets the way the earth keeps roots, and Obinna, the high priest who brought Adaize into the world with his own hands and who wept when King Emenike explained what he intended to do. Obinna had objected at first. He had spoken of the gods and the ancestors and the laws that held the world in its proper shape. King Emenike had listened to every word. Then he had asked Obinna one question. "Which of my nephews do you trust with Idu?" Obinna had gone quiet. The answer was none of them. They both knew it. Everyone in the palace knew it. The eldest nephew was a man who solved every problem with his fist. The second was weak in the way that made dangerous men feel safe around him. The third was simply not there. Not in his mind, not anywhere that mattered. Idu would not survive any of them. Obinna had wept again, and then he had nodded. When Adaize turned 17, King Emenike summoned the court and told them his heir had been found, a nephew from a distant branch of the royal family, a young man named Obiora, who had been raised in a far village, educated in secret, and was now ready to be presented and prepared for succession. He produced documents, he produced a history, he produced a story that was complete enough, old enough, and distant enough that no one could easily disprove it. And he presented Adaize. She walked into that court dressed in royal male attire, her frame wrapped in layers of fabric that concealed everything, her face set with the expression her father had spent 2 years teaching her to carry. Not arrogance, not coldness, something harder to argue with than either. Certainty, the look of someone who already knew they belonged. The elders had studied her. The chiefs had questioned her. The senior warrior had tested her knowledge of military strategy for 3 hours without stopping. She had answered every question. Not adequately, brilliantly. There had been murmurs, there had been sideways looks, there had been one elderly chief who had stared at her for so long that the room had grown uncomfortable. But there was no accusation, because the story was solid, because King Emenike's authority was still absolute, and because what they saw standing before them was not a woman pretending to be a man. What they saw was a king. King Emenike died 8 months later. It was as though he had held on just long enough to put everything in place, to hand Idu to the only hands he trusted,
and then allowed himself to rest. Adaize buried her father in full royal ceremony. She stood at his grave in the regalia of King Obiora and did not let a single tear fall in public. Not one. She saved them for the night. She gave them to the darkness where no one could see. And then she woke up the next morning and ruled. The first year was the hardest. There were men in that court who had been ruling kingdoms since before she was born, men whose fathers had served her grandfather, men who tested every new king the way storms test new buildings, probing for weakness, pushing at the edges, watching for the crack that told them where to press harder. She gave them nothing. When the Eastern chief questioned her judgment on a land dispute, she laid out the full history of the land, the terms of the original agreement signed 40 years before, and the legal implications of every option available, and she did it in the time it took him to finish his cup of palm wine. He had not spoken against her again. When 2 northern villages went to war over water rights and 3 previous attempts at mediation had failed, she traveled there herself. She sat with both sides for 2 days. She listened to everything. She found the one agreement that gave each side enough to choose peace. She left on the 3rd day with both chiefs walking behind her. Word traveled. The way word always travels in kingdoms. Not through announcements, but through stories. Stories passed between traders on the road, between farmers at the market, between warriors who had seen something they could not fully explain. The new king was something different, something precise, something that did not waste motion or words, something that always seemed to know more than it should. The kingdom responded the way kingdoms respond to genuine leadership. It grew. Trade routes expanded. New alliances were formed with kingdoms that had kept their distance from Idu for a generation. The army was reorganized, not enlarged, reorganized, which is a harder and more important thing. The harvest taxes were restructured so that the villages that produced the most were not punished for their productivity. A new system of dispute resolution was introduced that cut the time between a complaint and a judgment from months to weeks. Idu became rich. Not the kind of rich that sits in one room and rots, the kind that moves, the kind that builds roads and fills markets and gives young men reasons to stay in their home villages instead of drifting to larger kingdoms. 20 years in, Idu was no longer just a kingdom, it was the largest kingdom in the region. Other rulers sent envoys, other rulers sent gifts. 3 different kings from neighboring territories sent proposals for alliance through marriage, not knowing what they were proposing, and King Obiora declined each one with a precision that somehow made the declining feel like an honor. She never took a wife. The court had expected it. The elders had pressed for it. She had managed the pressure the way she managed everything, with patience and with answers that satisfied the surface of the question without opening any door beneath it. There were health concerns, carefully constructed and occasionally referenced. There were political considerations, always plausible, always shifting. There was always a reason. And King Obiora's reasons, like everything else about King Obiora, were never easy to argue with. Obina knew. Nwosu knew. Her father's ghost knew, if ghosts know anything. No one else did. 30 years, 35, approaching 40. She grew older in the way trees grow older. Not weakening, but deepening. The lines on her face became marks of authority rather than signs of age. The grey that appeared at her edges made her look not old but permanent, like something that had always been there and would always be there. She moved through the palace with the unhurried confidence of someone who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone a long time ago. But the body is honest, even when the life built around it is not. In her 38th year, Adaize began to feel the weight that comes when a life has given everything it has. Not the dramatic weight of illness, but the quiet weight of completion. The feeling that comes when a purpose has been fully lived. She did not tell the court. She told Obina, who wept for the 3rd time in his long life. She told him what she wanted. She wanted the kingdom to know. Not as a confession, not as a scandal, as a testimony. She spent her final 2 years preparing a document, a complete account of everything. Her birth, her father's decision, the preparation, the 40 years of service. Written in her own hand in the careful, precise language she had used to govern an empire. She handed it to Obinna with one instruction. Read it to them after I am gone. She died on a Tuesday morning when the light was still low and the compound was quiet. Obinna was with her. She did not die afraid. She did not die uncertain. She died the way she had lived, with her eyes open and everything in order. When Obinna read that letter to the court, the world of every man in that room broke open and rebuilt itself in the space of a single hour. Chukwemeka, the elder who had served King Obiora for 20 years, sat down in the middle of the floor and could not stand up for a long time. He thought about every moment he had doubted the king's decisions before they proved correct. Every time he had wondered in private whether this king was truly made for this throne. Every question he had carried, and he understood now that the doubt had never been about the king. It had been about himself, about what he had been taught to believe was possible. The senior warrior walked out of the court and stood alone for an hour. He had fought beside King Obiora in 3 wars. He had watched that king read a battlefield the way other men read simple words. He had trusted that king with his life and the lives of every man under his command, and that trust had never been misplaced, not once. He stood in the sun and asked himself what exactly had changed. He could not find an answer, because nothing had changed except the story he thought he had been living. The young chiefs, the ones who had only ever known King Obiora's Idu, sat in the silence of the court and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite pride, but lived exactly between the two. What Adaize had built did not disappear when the truth arrived. The roads were still there. The trade routes were still there. The alliances were still there. The system she had created to resolve disputes was still working in every village. The army she had reorganized was still the most disciplined force in the region. The harvests were still full. The kingdom was still standing. Everything she had built outlasted the secret that protected it. 3 days after the letter was read, the council met. The debate was fierce. There were men who wanted to erase her from the record, to call the 40 years illegitimate, to pretend it had not happened. There were men who argued for exactly the opposite. The argument lasted 1 full day. On the 2nd day, the senior chief, a man who had been a boy when King Obiora took the throne, stood up and said what everyone in the room already knew, but had not yet found the courage to say out loud. Idu is what it is today because of what she did, not despite it, because of it. You do not erase a foundation, you build on it. The vote was not close. They buried Adaize with full royal ceremony, every honor that belonged to a king of Idu. The royal drums, the royal cloth, the royal procession through the streets of the kingdom she had made into an empire. The people lined the road, and many of them wept, not for a king they had lost, because they understood now they had never fully known that king. They wept for something harder to name, for the size of what one person had carried alone, for the 40 years of silence that had made all of their lives possible. Obinna walked at the front of the procession, old now, older than he had any right to be, his eagle feather still in his wrapper, his face carrying everything he had witnessed across a lifetime. At the graveside, before the earth was closed, he said only this: "She came to serve. She stayed to build. She left nothing behind but everything." The kingdom of Idu stood and listened, and the earth received its king. Was she right to do it, or should she have found another way? Drop your answer in the comments. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs it today. And drop a comment. We want to hear from you. God bless you.